Hi, Fred.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Okay, how are you?
Good. I should say for our podcast listeners that I'm Bob Wright and you're Fred Kaplan. You write for Slate, and you've just written a book, right? Called Daydream Believers. Is that true?
Daydream Believers?
Yes.
A few grand ideas wrecked American power.
And are you worried that some of our younger viewers won't know that that's an allusion to a song by the Monkees?
No, I wondered about that. My kids, who are 22, knew it very well because the Monkees is apparently on Nickelodeon and other things.
Well, I think in general, I mean, not that this is our topic today, but I think college-age kids these days are more conversant in our generation's music than we were anyway. Oh. I digress.
They're more conversant with our music than vice versa.
Well, then vice versa, certainly, but I think than we were to people, however many decades older than us in our day.
Oh, yeah, that's certainly true.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Where do they get all the brain power, these kids?
It beats me.
Okay, so your book.
Yes.
Now, you've been touring, right? I heard you on NPR. I heard you on the prestigious show Fresh Air.
Yeah, I was there, indeed.
Yeah, which is, by the way, an honor that's never been conferred on me. But
I'm sorry.
I'm not bitter. I'm not bitter. But I want to give you an opportunity to tell us about your book. And, how sometimes when you're on a book tour, I'm sure this didn't happen on Terry Gross, but sometimes you're on a book tour and,
You're trying to tell me you haven't read the book?
Well, I was going to say, and the radio host purports to have read the book, but it becomes clear they haven't. And I was just going to say, you're not going to have that problem today because I don't purport to have read the book because your publisher has not sent me a copy.
Oh, well, that's very bad.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that they would just, that blogging has...
You were on the list. What can I say?
Well, I don't know, but I've seen the jacket. It looks good.
Okay, well, that's good.
It's getting attention, and you should be happy that I haven't read it because now you can just... all I can say is pitch it exactly the way you want it.
Well, here's the basic thesis. The basic thesis is that most of the disasters in U.S. foreign and military policy of recent years stem from two grand misconceptions. One, that the world changed after September 11th, when in fact it didn't, and that we emerged from the Cold War stronger than we were. You remember the phrase sole superpower, when in fact in some very important ways we were weaker. So do you want me to elaborate on that a little bit before you go all breathless?
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, let me do a little breathless. I should say that I don't have to have read the book to be sure that it's a very good book because I've read so much of your stuff on Slate. And unlike almost everyone who writes on things bearing on national security, you've actually got a whole lot of experience. You've been writing about national security for a long time and specializing in it, as you still do on Slate. So I can without reservation recommend the book. And I can say that I may actually want to argue with you a little about the extent to which...
I want you to argue with me.
I will on this issue.
What am I here if you're not going to argue with me?
Exactly. That's what Blogging Heads is for. I do plan to get around to maybe taking issue with you on this question of to what extent things did change after 9/11. Okay. But first of all, tell us the sense in which you think they didn't and what you think was the confused idea of how they did change.
Right. Well, they didn't in the sense that the principles of politics among nations, the fundamental nature of war, the nature of power, the basic motivation of human beings did not change. What changed primarily is that Americans realized that they were vulnerable in a way that they hadn't really internalized before, and that certain trends which had been in fact in place for the previous 15 years were starting to gallop, to gain in steam.
So there was a new national security environment that had been emerging.
Right, and that's where the misinterpretation of the end of the Cold War comes in.
Okay.
The Cold War, for all its horrors and depravities, was also a system of international security. I mean, to oversimplify things, you had the Western Bloc, which was led by the U.S., and the Eastern Bloc, which was led by the Soviet Union, and at least in the Western Bloc, in exchange for giving up a certain amount of sovereignty in the sense of pursuing their own truly national interest, they gave in to U.S. interests knowing that we were going to provide a security umbrella over them. Well, then comes 1991, the Soviet Union implodes. There is no common enemy anymore, that in fact it's the common enemy as much as American power that's stitching this alliance together. And over a period of several years, the other countries that were in this alliance begin to realize that, hey, we can start going our own way, pursue our own interests, without that much attention paid to what Washington thinks about the matter. And what Bush did, the impact of Bush on this, is they came into power thinking to the contrary, that we are now so powerful, we don't need to pay any attention to allies at all. We don't need to pay attention to any treaties that have been signed that go against what we would like to do. And so they accelerated this process. If in fact you're weaker in the sense of you don't have the ability to work your will on others as seamlessly and as automatically as you did before, and you come into office thinking that you're in fact much stronger, even that you're omnipotent, then you're going to be weaker still.
Okay.
That's the basic gist of this.
Okay, and when you refer to new kinds of threats that had been emerging for 15 years or so prior to 9/11, right. Can you elaborate on those a little?
Well, I mean, when the Eastern Bloc fell apart, you don't have the Soviet Union putting the kibosh on the stand countries, and you just have all these countries in the middle that are no longer coming under superpower pressure anymore. And they tend to go their own way as well. I mean, I think I think that what's going on in Pakistan, Afghanistan, all of this, it's a part. It's everything is out of control. It's the end of not just the Soviet Union but the Cold War system that encompassed the Soviet Union and that in fact made the United States as strong as it was at the time.
Okay. Now you haven't mentioned terrorism yet. I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do in the book. But
well, yeah, I mean terrorism. Why is there an increase in this? I mean terrorism. Brian Jenkins started writing about terrorism at the Rand Corporation, 30 years ago or something. It's not a new thing at all. But it's just harder to put it under control. The Soviet Union, when they were around, they were much stiffer in terms of keeping their client states from getting nuclear weapons, from having splinter movements erupt within the countries. The sort of a lot of left-wing scholars in the day decried this condominium that the two superpowers were imposing on the rest of the world. And while I'm not making apologies for any of it, we see what happens when this condominium crumbles and there isn't anything in place to replace it. Okay. Things are spinning out of control.
Okay. So when you say that the recent trouble with American foreign policy, notably the Iraq fiasco, mm-hmm. can be traced to kind of two basic misconceptions. Is that to suggest that you think that basically, there are kind of two views of how we got into Iraq, or at least two views. Yeah. And one sees it as this kind of culmination of a single, very coherent movement, identified with neocons. And another view just views it as kind of a confluence of forces mm-hmm. that included the neocons.
Yeah, I'm a confluence guy.
You're a confluence guy. So
let's look at the neocons. I mean, they're an important force, to be sure. But are these guys... Can anyone seriously suggest that Paul Wolfowitz had Donald Rumsfeld wrapped around his finger? Or that, Elliot Abrams or somebody had Dick Cheney wrapped around his finger? I mean, Rumsfeld wasn't a neocon. Cheney wasn't a neocon. Bush, until later, wasn't by any stretch a neocon. There were a few things going on that converged. I mean, Rumsfeld and Cheney were basically 19th century imperial nationalists. I mean, they're into the expansion of American power and the expansion of executive power as defined as American power. Now, Bush we can go into this later, but he got in his head some ideas about spreading freedom as a central ingredient in American foreign policy. But here's the thing. His view of freedom was America. I mean, basically that everybody would be like us if only these tyrants didn't have their jackboots on their necks. So if Bush is in favor of expanding freedom, defined as how we are in the United States, and Rumsfeld and Cheney are for the expansion of American power, you can see how those two paths basically converge, even though the starting point might be different.
Okay. And the idea, just to get our terminology clear, this idea that freedom was, well, that our job was to spread freedom, that comes out of kind of neocon thought, right?
Well,
I mean, the way my question is, what is your definition of a neocon? Because this is rarely made clear in discussions of this.
Well, that's a very good point. But, yeah, he did come into neocon, but he entered it from a slightly different path. One guy whose influence has been underestimated, I believe, is Mike Gerson. His former speechwriter, the social evangelist.
Now an op-ed columnist for the Washington Post.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Gerson was on his staff. He wrote a speech at Bush's request while Bush was still running for office in 1999 at the Reagan Library about foreign policy. Mm-hmm. And this was an antecedent to Bush's second inaugural address, which talked about freedom as the great force in humanity. I mean, it's been a forgotten speech, but there it is. Now, shortly after that, Bush, never referred to it again until 2004. But it was there from the beginning. What Gerson's role was that he also, his ideas, which on foreign policy he called, conservatism. What was that phrase? Compassionate conservatism writ large. That was his view of foreign policy. That converged with the neocons as well. And then, here is where the neocons enter into it. 2004 election, Bush wins. He's feeling really good. A friend of his stops by, pays him a visit, gives him an advance copy of Natan Sharansky's new book, The Case for Democracy.
Right.
Sharansky had given a speech about a year earlier at an American Enterprise Institute conference. And he had given this speech at the request of Richard Pearl, who was, I think, a big leader of the AEI. I forget what his rank was at the time, who was worried that Bush was about to do some kind of deal with giving the Palestinians, approving a Palestinian state. He was about to give a speech on the subject. So he wanted Sharansky to go in and put this in a proper perspective. And Sharansky gave this speech. Cheney was at the meeting. That basically what's going on in the Middle East is not some tribal thing. It has nothing to do with Israelis and Palestinians. It's about freedom versus tyranny. It's about the forces of freedom and the forces of darkness. And he puts it all in the perspective of the fight for terrorism. He says just as the struggle in the previous several decades was the fight between the United States and Soviet Union, or those were the forces of freedom and forces of darkness then, now the forces of freedom and darkness are democracy, freedom, and terrorism. And he said that the Palestinians should achieve statehood, but not until they throw out their current leaders, elect new people, and do 50 other things that they weren't about to do right now. But Bush picked up on this. But not only that, he picked up on this as what would be the centerpiece of his foreign policy. A lot of experts had told him that his original ideas about freedom, this business about freedom is a gift from God. Oh.
Go ahead.
I'll call you back. That freedom is a gift from God. Sorry about that. Freedom is a gift from God and so forth. Nobody bought it, and he adopted it. Now he says, okay, this is where it's at. And he told people at the time, there are interviews where he says, if you want to know where I'm taking foreign policy, read Natan Sharansky's book. And then he comes up with a second inaugural address, which is taken straight from the book. Now let's look at this thing about how freedom is a gift from God. Okay. If you really believe this, if it's not just some bromide, if you really believe it, the implications are rather profound. What it means is that freedom is sort of the default mode of humanity. And that all you have to do is knock off the tyrant's head, blow up the manhole cover, and freedom will spew forth like a geyser. Now, the implication of that is that after that happens, you don't really need to do much. It just happens automatically. So Bush, one reason why Bush didn't plan Phase 4 of Iraq post-war is that he really didn't think anything had to happen. The Iraqis would do their own thing. The reason why Rumsfeld wasn't terribly eager to plan for post-war came from a different angle. He was pushing this notion of military transformation, this idea that you could just go in with a very small, light force, and owing to new technologies such as smart bombs and surveillance gear that can look at the entire battlefield, the information technologies replace mass.
And is this the revolution in military affairs?
The revolution in military affairs.
And he was right to the extent that, yes, you can win the initial... you can seize the city, you can depose the dictator, right? Mm-hmm. With very little exertion of force. They had shown that in Afghanistan.
He was right, and the generals were wrong on that. What he didn't quite grasp is that that's the beginning of your trouble. Not especially in a country that once the jackboot of the oppressor, Saddam Hussein in this case, is lifted, you have all these teeming sectarian forces that need to be brought under some new control.
Okay, now can I mean, here's one place I actually think where things had changed a little. I think, in a way, the very technologies that had indeed made it easier to conquer a country, in a way made it harder to maintain control, in the sense that those very technologies help insurgents. They're conducive to the decentralized exertion of power, in a sense. I mean, insurgents use these remote control microelectronic things from toys to detonate IEDs, and they use their cell phones and they use the internet and so on, right?
That's true. But I mean, I think you could do both. But see, here's the thing: Rumsfeld's whole point about Rumsfeld was attracted to transformation because he saw that as the vehicle for continued American preeminence and power projection in the post-Cold War world. In other words, Iraq in that sense was kind of a demonstration war. He didn't really care that much about Iraq. It was to send the message to all the other bad guys in the world that, hey, look at what we can do. And therefore, if you then tell them, well, okay, that's right, we only need 100,000 troops to go in and knock off Saddam Hussein, but then if you told him, but then, by the way, we might need 300,000 troops to stay there for 5 or 10 years to impose order, he doesn't want to hear that, because that nullifies the whole theory. That nullifies the whole point of transformation. That doesn't send a signal to Iran and Syria and North Korea that, hey, we can topple you with one hand tied behind your back. So enter Chalabi, Ahmad Chalabi. And I don't know if Rumsfeld was ever nuts about Ahmad Chalabi, as Wolfowitz and others were, but he went along with it because unless you had Chalabi sitting there saying, oh, I can take over and don't worry, everything will be fine, that allows you to delude yourself with the basic ingredient of transformation, namely that you can do all this with a very small force. So there's all kinds of mutual enabling and converging tracks that go into some of the disasters that we've unleashed the last few years. Okay,
so you basically had two main tracks. Well, maybe three. I mean, you had neocons. You had Rumsfeld, who was not a neocon, but who saw the wars opportunistically as a demonstration of a new capability. And then you had Cheney was not exactly in either category, right? I mean, there's something deeper moving him that I don't totally understand.
I think Cheney is just, Cheney would have been a terrific, senior apparatchik in 19th century Imperial Germany. I mean, he is an old-fashioned, nationalist in that sense. So there's nothing terribly complicated about it. He's also ideologically driven to a degree, but not. I don't think he buys any of the neocon ingredients in the sense of democracy and that sort of thing. So that's not where his head is at.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. So I guess you're saying the sense in which they overestimated the extent to which things had changed was they thought that this was some kind of unipolar moment where we didn't have to worry about alliances and so on. Seems to me
That's right.
Right, but it seems to me there's a sense in which they really underestimated the extent to which things had changed. And that has to do with terrorism. It seems to me that 30, 40 years ago, well, during the Cold War, in the heart of the Cold War, 50s, early 60s, you didn't have to worry a lot about what the public around the world thought of you. I mean, so long as every national leader in the world was either liked you or feared you, in other words, either was an ally or someone too cowed to attack, you were pretty much okay. And in fact we sponsored some coups, in the early 50s, and even if they brought to power leaders that the people resented, or many of the people resented, that didn't come back to haunt us in a big way anytime soon at all, right? I mean, so
it took a decade or so,
right? Because terrorism was not an issue, so it didn't matter whether you were creating these breeding grounds for anti-American resentment that could in turn give rise to terrorists who could ultimately do catastrophic things. And by the way, we haven't actually seen those, as you know. I mean, nuclear biological weapons is the true nightmare scenario, which would make 9/11 pale by comparison. So it seems to me that, I mean, one thing the Iraq War, a lot of Bush's foreign policy, early foreign policy, first-term foreign policy, was conducted with almost complete disregard for the opinion of it, and the opinion of America around the world, right? And it seems to me that has truly changed. Our national security is dependent on the opinion of just grassroots opinion of America around the world.
But this has been true to a degree that they didn't realize, and I think you could even say to some extent, maybe nobody quite realized, for some time now. I mean, I recall, and it goes beyond terrorism. For example, early on, it was sometime in 2002, Bush went to an ASEAN conference, I think it was, and, he's over there and he says, terrorism, 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 war on terrorism, war on terrorism, and tepid applause, and then the president of China gets up and he says, we want to trade with all of you. We want to sign most favored nations treaties with everybody. We want trade. We want, and people were crowding around him afterwards. I mean, I think the one of the real misunderstandings of this administration is the degree to which terrorism, while certainly crucial, is not the number one issue in international politics, especially not for other countries, and really not for us either. And I think part of the perception of intransigence. I mean, another good example is there was a NATO conference, again, I believe it was in 2002, where they were going to get together. The whole point of the conference was they were going to lay out a common plan for terrorism, or for counterterrorism. And this was going to disprove this whole notion that there were rifts in the transatlantic alliance, and wait till you see. And so the Bush people go over there, and all they're doing is trying to recruit other nations to come join us in the war on Iraq. Not come join us, pressuring them to fight, to go after Iraq. Nothing about anything else. And I believe this was about the time when Rumsfeld talked about old Europe and new Europe. And the editorials in the European papers after that were just outraged. Never before has America so dominated a NATO alliance. It's clear that these guys view NATO as a toolbox, not as anything serious. And that's when, at least among the countries that were our traditional allies, the rift started happening. You remember, right after 9/11, there was maybe one of the most moving incidents in the entire history of NATO. We're attacked. The other NATO countries get together and they invoke Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. In Article 5, that's the one that says if one country comes under attack, all the others respond. And this was put in there. The idea behind it was that the United States will come assist the defense of any European country that's attacked. And now here's the Europeans saying, America, you have been attacked and we are now going to come to your defense. And Bush just kind of waved them off. said, nah, don't worry about it. We can do this. There was this notion. People looked. They had an allergy to anything that Clinton had done. Clinton said that the sky was blue. They would come up with all kinds of ways to show that it was really.
Well, in fact, that's one thing they didn't like about sending a lot of people into Iraq, right? It was the Clinton administration that had that thought that you needed a big occupying force.
Yeah, they hated Powell too. So the whole Powell doctrine, which was a little bit misnamed. I mean, that was just classic military history.
Yeah.
That you needed a large force. They wanted to put that in the dustbin of history as well. But they looked at the Kosovo War, and they said this is exactly what goes wrong when you do alliance warfare. Look how inefficient this targeting is. Look how long this is taking. We are never going to do anything. What they didn't realize is that this wasn't. They forgot this basic Clausewitzian dictum about war is politics by other means. That, in other words, there are political objectives. One thing that was being demonstrated in Kosovo, the reason why Kosovo and Bosnia were relative successes, is that there really was a coalition here. There was an alliance. This was NATO, responding to tyranny and ethnic cleansing in the heart of their own continent. This was their area of operation. And so it wasn't just the United States bullying its way into some conflict, and it wasn't just, anti-Muslim or something like that. This was an alliance. Same thing with the 91 Gulf War. I mean, talk about a coalition. I mean, practically every country in the Middle East was in on that. Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. They were all sending... not just yes, go do it. They were sending divisions, armed divisions.
Not only that, but it had the sanction of the United Nations in kind of classic fashion. It was one of the few actual exercises of collective security as originally envisioned by the UN. In other words, a nation commits trans-border aggression, and all the other nations get together and say, sorry, that's illegal.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
But you had all these Muslim and Arab countries, and did they really do that much? No. But they were there. In other words, it was communicating, hey, this is just unacceptable. What the United States is doing under UN auspices is completely legitimate as far as we're concerned. Say Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and all the rest. Contrast that with what happened now, and nobody even wants to come help us because the whole cause is in disrepute.
Okay, so it sounds like there's two different senses in which the extent of change had been overestimated by the administration and its supporters. One is they thought that we had moved from a bipolar world to a kind of unipolar world, and that was a mistake because multilateralism was as important as ever. Secondly, you're saying that it sounds like you're saying they exaggerated the importance of the terrorist threat, which I don't. If that's what you're saying, there's a sense in which I don't agree with you. But is that what you're...
I don't make that point explicitly, but I think this goes a little bit afield from what I wrote. But I do think that what is one lesson that we've learned lately about countering terrorism? Remember when John Kerry said it's more than anything it's a problem for intelligence and law enforcement, and that's basically been true. I mean the successful acts of counterterrorism that have happened in the last 6 years, that's exactly what it's been. We haven't done much sending in loads of forces just to do military acts.
Well, we've created more terrorists. That's something, right?
There you go. Exactly.
But what I would say, I guess, is I think we have overestimated the short-term threat posed by terrorism. At least the administration, implicit in its policy, has been an overestimation of the short-term threat. In other words, we got to invade Iraq now. Any moment now, a teaspoonful of whatever could turn into a mushroom cloud or something. And they've underestimated the fact that in the long run, that kind of fear is actually valid. And if you took it seriously as a long-term threat, you would want to do things like, nurture multilateral arms control structures.
I'll go with that. One basic thing is that, the United States has always gotten by on alliances. We are not a country that's going to spend $2 trillion a year on the military and have a 2 or 3 million man army, short of existential threat to our country. Just not going to happen. So we're not going to fill the vacuum that's been left by the collapse of the Cold War system. Therefore, we're going to need alliances. We're going to need coalitions. These things can't be taken for granted anymore. I think, the United States, I'm not, somebody in the Wall Street Journal, and I appreciate getting denounced by name on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, congratulations. I didn't know.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It was in an article that was headlined, Marinating in Declinism.
That's you?
That's me, and the guy who wrote that book, The Second World. We were lumped together. It's not declinism. I mean, I'm not saying, I think the United States still is the only country that has global reach, politically, economically, militarily. I think there are many nations out there that would like to see the restoration of American leadership. All I'm saying is that it can't be assumed anymore. It can't be taken for granted. It's not easy. It's going to be even harder. And it's funny, both Democratic candidates say, oh, well, I will re-engage the allies. I will reform alliances. And that's great, but, it's going to be a lot harder than anybody realizes.
You think so?
Well, yeah, because, not to get the first moves going, but you're going to go over there and say, okay, here we are, we're back. Forget what happened in the last 8 years. They can't just say, okay, pretend it's the year 2000 again, or 1996, or 1992. No, because these guys have had a taste of going their own direction, of pursuing their own interests. If you want to get country X to follow us on dubious policy Y, they're going to have to be persuaded into it. They're going to want to know something.
Well, what if we avoid dubious policies? Won't that help?
Well, that will help. But for example, when back in 2006, when the Israel-Hezbollah conflict happened, and Condi didn't see the point of doing shuttle diplomacy, and she said, or going to talk to Syria, she said, look, the Syrians know what they need to do. Well, that's true in a way. But what the Syrians don't know is what's in it for them. If they're going to do X, they're going to alienate some of their own current allies. And what's going to be in it for them to come over to our side of the creek? And that we never made clear, never even began to make clear. These days, there's some risk for a lot of countries in taking sides openly with the United States. It's a lamentable thing.
But don't you think to some extent a change in the face that represents us? I mean, especially if it's, a change of ethnicity or gender, a dramatically new face. Don't you think that will... that'll help things a little in that regard?
It'll help things a lot. It'll put things on a new basis, but then they're still going to want to know on day 2... okay, now, what is the United States doing these days? I see you've got a new face, and I kind of like the face, but now what are you going to do? And that, it's not going to be, okay, we're doing this and follow us along, because, and by the way, if you don't follow us, look at the Russian bear over the horizon. The Russian bear isn't there anymore. The consequences of not following us aren't so clear anymore. It's going to be very difficult. Americans, for all the time that Americans were active, were persistent and dominant actors in the world since World War II, we were superpowers. Now we're not superpowers anymore. Whoever's the next president is going to want to get involved in the world again in a productive way, and he or she is going to find that it's not just a question of going in front of the General Assembly and saying, forget about these last 8 years, we're back. The other guys have been around the block on their own. They've learned how to not just pedal the bicycle, but get on the motorbike or whatever. Choose your own crappy metaphor. But the point is, they're going to want to know what's in it for them. I mean,
yeah, well, they would have anyway. I mean, I wonder whether you're overestimating in this sense, the importance of the last 4 years. In other words, even if Bush hadn't gone through this kind of maniacally unilateral phase, it would still be the objective case that after the end of the Cold War, some things actually did change. One is that, first of all,
by the way, I think the world did change after the end of the Cold War.
Right.
I see 9/11 as not being the pivot. I see December 1991 as the pivot.
Yeah, but 9/11, some of it came to the attention of people in a way it might not have otherwise.
Exactly.
And I mean, first of all, our relative economic power compared to other nations has declined somewhat, and it will almost certainly continue to. But secondly, because of the end of the Cold War, our former allies don't need us in the same immediate sense in which they did before. At least it's not as tangible to them. Now, you might argue that terrorism does pose the same kind of threat in a sense that communism did, and so we are all in this together. But first of all, that includes a bunch of people beyond our former allies that are in this together. And secondly, it's a more complicated situation. I mean, there's nothing more kind of conveniently unified than a single unified enemy in the form of an empire, right? And that really did change. And it seems to me that even if, regardless of the last 4 years, it would now be the case that our former allies just need us. It's less evident to them that they need us than it was during the Cold War.
That's what I'm saying. And in fact, they really do need us, but we have to demonstrate that, and we can't just assert it. That's my point.
Yeah.
And we can't just say, come with us. Deals have to be made. I mean, this is nothing new. I mean, you remember Fukuyama, who later said he was wrong, the whole end of history thing. No. I mean, the Cold War was really a period when history was frozen. The sort of natural forces that you see going back in centuries, they were frozen into this bipolar state. Now, its history is back with a vengeance. And that kind of history is something that American leaders and American populations are not used to grappling with in a way that where we're not really so much the unchallengeable leaders. We're sort of senior management. There's a lot of very, like the Lebowski line. It's a complex case, lots of ins and outs and what have yous. It's something that we're going to have to struggle with, and that's the part that's not going to be easy. I mean, to get certain unsavory nations to go along with us, first of all, we're going to have to deal with unsavory nations. And second, we might have to give up a couple things ourselves to get them to go along, and that's just the way it is.
And what do you think are the most important goals for us to pursue? In other words, what should we be trying to get these other nations to do that may be hard?
Well, I think the hardest, and don't look to me for any answers either.
I always look to you for answers, Fred.
Well, I'm about to disabuse you. But non-proliferation. I mean, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is a seriously flawed thing right now. The deal, which was, first came about in the 60s, was, okay, there are 5 nuclear powers, and we get to keep the bomb, but in exchange for all of you guys pledging not to develop the bomb, we are going to give you the technology for peaceful nuclear energy. That was the deal. And by the way, and we'll also protect you. We'll also give you security guarantees.
And we claimed we would eventually move ourselves toward disarmament, but...
Yeah, although, you look at the exact wording of that, it's very loose. But yeah, and we've done a little bit of that. But here's the thing. What we've learned in recent years is that this peaceful nuclear energy pushed to an extreme is very easily convertible to not so peaceful nuclear
Yeah, we thought that was going to be the hard part, right?
Yeah, that's right. But now, with uranium enrichment, I mean, the Iranians have been in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty because some of the things they've done covertly. But what they're doing in itself is not a violation of the NPT at all.
Well, there's also the problem that they can just opt out of the NPT when they get sick of it anyway.
No, well, yeah, they could do that, but what they could also do is quite legally, push the enrichment, keep it going, and then when they get to the point where it is weapons grade, then they can opt out of the NPT. So, what we need to come up with are some new sets of incentives.
Yeah.
I mean, people talk bribery. Well, call it bribery, call it diplomacy, call it incentives. It's all the same thing, really. We bribed them with peaceful nuclear energy technology in the 60s and 70s. What are we going to bribe them with now? I mean, you look at a country like Iran, North Korea. If those two countries were run by the most rational people on earth, they would still have very rational reasons for wanting to have a pocket full of nuclear weapons.
Oh, sure. I mean, there were three countries in the axis of evil, those two in Iraq. Iraq didn't have nuclear weapons, and we invaded it. So what would you do? I would get nuclear weapons.
Yeah, no, the North Koreans put out a statement after the 2003 war saying the lesson of this war is that you should get yourself a deterrent to keep the Americans from invading you. They say that Saddam Hussein's big mistake back in 1991 was not having nuclear weapons before he invaded Kuwait. That's their view, and it's not an irrational view. So here's the question: what do we do to keep these countries from going nuclear? Now, I don't think if Iran gets nuclear weapons, I'm kind of between the two points of view on this. I'm not among these realists who think, oh well, no big deal, we can deter them. I don't want to see Iran getting nuclear weapons. It's not so much. I don't think they're going to bomb Jerusalem, much less bomb New York. But, having nuclear weapons in your pocket allows you to get away with certain kinds of aggression, and it deters other people from doing much to you with conventional force.
Well, and it encourages neighboring states to develop nuclear weapons, and it increases by some amount, even though I don't think Iran would be casually handing nukes to terrorists, even those nominally under their control. It does any increase in the world's stockpile of nuclear arms, especially when they're spreading to whole new countries, does increase by some increment the chances that someday terrorists will get a hold of them.
Well, another thing is, the United States and the Soviet Union spent decades developing safety devices, permissive action links. Right. And I guess Pakistan's are fairly safe. This is one reason why a lot of U.S. military officials have gone over there lately. I'll have to call you back. Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's a Blogging Heads moment whenever anything real life intrudes on our videos, and that's what we're here for. So we agree that nukes in Iran are not something to celebrate.
My dog hasn't started to bark yet. Oh.
Maybe that's
Hello?
him.
I'm doing an interview. I have to call you back. Bye. Daughters, dogs, I tell you, live radio.
Has the wife called yet?
Something. Huh? No, I don't think. Well, she might have been the one I hung up on. I don't know.
Well, as long as that was just your wife, it's okay. But so we agree that.
So the point is, what are the new incentives? What do we do?
Right. I was about to ask you that question. So what do we do about Iran?
Well, see, you look to me for all the answers, and what I'm telling you is on that one, I don't. I mean, there are lots of things you can say that are obviously we have to do the grand settlement of the regional, blah blah blah, and but people have been saying that for ages. I don't see much prospect for it, but. Something at least has to be dealt with seriously. These countries have to be taken seriously, dealt with seriously. One thing that kept a lot of anti-American sentiment under wraps all through the Bush 1 and Clinton administrations is that we at least seemed to be genuinely trying to work a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Nothing much happened, and maybe it was impossible for anything to happen, but there was a genuine and justifiable perception of goodwill there. The first thing that Bush does when he comes, maybe not the first thing, but it was high up on the list, he comes into power and he says, one of the big mistakes my dad made was to do this balanced approach in the Middle East. So we're not going to deal with this anymore. We're not going to have an envoy like Dennis Ross blowing out the matches every time somebody lights one. We're not going to do this. This is not what a superpower does. We're doing benign neglect. Israel, you take care of it any way you see fit, which is probably the worst thing that anybody can do in terms of trying to help Israel.
Yeah, well, they've changed their tune a little, but maybe a little late on that subject.
Quite late. I mean, see, that was a pathetic thing. I mean, this trip that Bush took to the Middle East, his first, which is also pretty awesome. He goes over there, he sits down, and Israel, at least the Fatah, president of Palestinian territories, says, okay, go to it, you guys, go have some talks, get things done. And seemed kind of mystified that nothing happened. I mean, I think that he really doesn't understand how hard it was to get these guys in the same room. He didn't understand what, the point of shuttle diplomacy, as it was practiced by, Kissinger and Baker and others. The whole idea is that you go back and forth communicating messages between two countries or among several countries that are unable for one reason or another to talk among themselves. Mm-hmm. This is very hard. It takes a lot of time, active energy. I mean, the guy that Bush put in charge of this whole new phase in the negotiations between Israel and Palestinians, retired General Jim Jones, he's doing that as a part-time effort. He has a corporate job. He didn't want to leave it. And they said, that's okay, just treat it as a part-time job. Yeah. So, aside from the fact that he's a lame duck, he's got less than a year to go, why do you want to sit down with somebody and then the whole game is going to change as soon as somebody new comes in? It was very clear that he's not taking it seriously. So why should anybody else take it seriously?
Now, speaking of Israel in the context of Iran, what do you think of this idea of if you could move Iran toward accepting, genuinely intrusive inspections and buying into a regional pact, regarding the control of nuclear weapons, if in order to do that, you had to get Israel to agree to shut down the Dimona reactor and not disarm, but do something like we did at the beginning of the NPT. In other words, this is a show of good faith. We're shutting down. We're not making any more from now. We do look forward. If things continue to go well, sure, we would like to see a denuclearized Middle East and so on. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't think Israel's going to do it.
No, but leaving that aside, I mean, well, no, but I mean, seriously, if we think it would be in Israel's interests, and it seems to me it would be preferable to either them bombing Iran or Iran getting a nuclear weapon. In other words, would be preferable from Israel's point of view. If you believe that, then we should try to encourage Israel to do it. So my first question is, would it make sense from their point of view?
From Israel's point of view? Well, they would need to get a lot to do that, I think. They would need a lot of other... So, it may be right. The quandary of the Middle East is that all these pieces really do fit together. I mean, it's not just, UN speak. Every problem that you can think of, while they each problem has its own separate dynamic and would still exist if you took care of two or three of the other problems, maybe. But still, they are all interrelated, and you can't fundamentally solve any one problem without at least dealing with a lot of the others. And this is just an approach that this administration hasn't even begun to do, that in fact it has explicitly rejected even considering doing, and B, would be very difficult to do both in terms of international politics and domestic politics. But I think you're right. Something like that has to budge. I mean, we and our allies are going to have to contemplate doing some unpleasant things, doing our second or third choice, settling for second or third choice conclusions rather than first choice. And the only thing that might drive us to that is the realization that failing to do that is going to be much, much worse.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now...
But I don't know. I mean, it's crazy tough. I mean, somebody's going to have to step into this. Someone like Dennis Ross is going to have to be hired for the job again and work on doing nothing but this for 4 years or 8 years or however long it takes.
Well, he's in the Obama camp, I think.
No, I don't think so. I mean, a lot of these people, let's put it this way. A lot of these guys who are listed as advisors by various campaigns, that means that somebody called them and said, I'd like your advice on this, and they talked on the telephone with them for a while. And I think someone like Dennis Ross would probably, as a matter of patriotic duty or something else, go with whoever wanted to hire him, knowing that they know what they're in for when they hire him, and they're hiring them because they take the job seriously. Mm-hmm. He worked for Bush 1, and he worked for Clinton, and he was also in the Pentagon, I believe, in the Reagan administration as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you're available, too, if the next president wants you. Is that right, Fred?
You know what? I like New York City too much. Nobody would want to put me through congressional.
You'd be in such a strong bargaining position. They would let you stay in New York. They would give you a penthouse suite, whatever you want.
Oh, well, now we're talking.
So in your book, you describe how we wound up in Iraq, among other things. And it seems to me that in the current presidential campaign, there's one looming irony, which is that, you stress that there were actually several contingents. There was a confluence of different forces and ideologies and considerations that got us into Iraq. Certainly one of them was the neocons. Now, their candidate in 2000, at least for a number of them, was not George Bush. It was John McCain.
That's right.
Now, you might think that after a war that most people consider a disaster, the way the feedback system would work in a nation would be that the candidate who was championed by the people who played a large role in getting us into that war would not get the nomination of a major party in the United States. But in this case, you would be wrong if you thought that, right?
Well, I think it's a sign of just how bereft of leadership the Republican Party is now. I mean, look, I'm not saying anything original here, but the Republican Party is going to have to settle for John McCain because they've got nobody else. There's a lot of factions in the Republican Party that are not too wild about this prospect.
Well, that's for sure. What do you think of his foreign policy? Do you find it alarming or what?
Yeah, I think it's a foreign policy in which no lessons have been learned. Let's take the surge. Should we talk about the surge a little bit?
Feel free.
I mean, the surge is not. When you say the surge is working, it really depends a lot on what you mean by working. What was the point of the surge? General Petraeus, whose name is holy, right?
He is an impressive guy, I think.
He is. There's no question. But he said all along, look, there is not a military solution to this problem. The point of the surge is to make Baghdad secure to the degree that the political factions can get their act together. They'll have a breathing space to settle their disputes. Well, Baghdad is better, but it's not secure, and they're not settling their disputes.
Yeah. And
by the way, this whole business of, the surge has worked, and therefore things are so much better that we can pull out 5 brigades in July, that's just nonsense. They're pulling out 5 brigades. It's a matter of arithmetic, not policy. The surge began in February of last year. There were 15-month tours of duty. By July, the last of the 5 brigades, their 15-month tours will be up. They will go home, and there are no combat brigades in the entire United States Army that are ready to replace them. So they'll go back from 20 brigades to the original 15, not because anything has happened, but because that's the way it was always planned. It was always going to be thus.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, Gates had this idea. What he wanted to do was to continue the drawdown at the same pace so that by the end of the year there would be just 10 brigades, because he has broader institutional concerns. His concern, like that of many senior military officers, is that the Army is falling apart. They don't have enough people. I mean, look at to get their recruitment numbers, they're having to accept, more high school dropouts than they have in 20 years, more
criminals.
Criminals, Category 4 aptitude scorers. I mean, the kind of people that 5 years ago they wouldn't have. They're losing junior officers. They're hemorrhaging junior officers. They had to offer captains $35,000 re-enlistment bonuses, and too many of the good ones aren't taking those. They're in deep trouble. And Gates, I did this profile of Gates for the New York Times Magazine.
I saw that, yeah.
And one thing that he said at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in Texas, right before he went to see troops at Fort Hood the next morning, was, we're in some trouble because the dads, these are our enlistment base, the dads are no longer encouraging their kids to enlist. As long as joining the Army means an instant assignment to Iraq, we're going to have problems.
Mm-hmm.
So his view is that Gates's view is that we need to be there for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not going to get the bipartisan support for that unless troop levels come way, way down. Well, now, even Gates admits the other day that, we might have to take a pause in troop reductions after July, because he went over to Iraq And Petraeus told him,
it's a mess.
Said, look, you know, if you want to come down to 10 brigades by the end of the year, well, you know, we can do that, and we'll carry out that order. But don't ask me to secure the Iraqi population with that small a force. I'm not going to be able to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Iraqi army is not ready to do it themselves. And so, you know, you have a choice. And you know what? This choice is also going to be faced by Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or John McCain. I mean, you know, they talk about pulling out troops, 1 brigade a month or 2 brigades a month, whatever it is. But at some point, the generals are going to say, okay, this is fine. I can do this. But do you still want to be able to do X, Y, and Z? Because if you do, I can't do it anymore.
And speaking of the presidential candidates, do you see much difference in foreign policy between Clinton and Obama?
In terms of their statements, no. In terms of their advisors, I can't say. I mean, I know who some of Obama's kind of second-tier foreign policy advisors are. I mean, the kind of people who would become deputy or assistant secretaries of state or defense. I don't know who his big honchos are.
Well, I mean, there's Anthony Lake, I guess.
Yeah.
He listens to Brzezinski, but I assume that Brzezinski is kind of a past retirement age.
Well, I think Brzezinski would never consider himself.
No, I didn't. I'm not saying he would consider himself that, but
the other thing is, I mean, look, there are only so many guys, and no matter who is a Democrat, you know, one of Hillary's big advisors, I'm sure if Obama's the candidate, he or she would go work for him if it came to that too.
Yeah, I mean, there's also Samantha Powers and Susan Rice you hear about in the Obama
but see, I don't see them as
right. They don't have the experience you would expect of somebody who's going to be Secretary of State.
Deputy assistant or deputy assistant secretaries. You know, I'm talking about the kind of person who, you know, can go to Europe, powwow with the big boys.
With Hillary, it would be Richard Holbrooke, right? We think. Secretary of State?
I would think that's a logical statement.
Would that be an auspicious development, you think?
In terms of, if your first criterion is to get people in there who know what they're doing, who know how things work, who know where the levers of power are, who know who you call up on the phone to get this done, yeah. I mean, there are things about him that I'm a little uncomfortable with, but...
Want to name one?
Well, he's a bit of a... No, actually,
you can use that word on Blogging Heads TV, Fred. Come on.
Anyway, he's you know, he some people find him unpleasant. Let's put it that way. But
that raises a serious question.
Any of these people would be seen as a welcome.
Well, sure, and so would I. And I would be a welcome departure, and you would, and so would whoever I see out the window at the moment. But let me ask you, let me follow up on Holbrooke. I mean, the non-profane way of saying maybe what you were going to say is that some people consider him arrogant, right?
Well, yeah. But
okay, now
maybe that's not bad.
But this is an interesting question. If we kind of agree that America has been behaving too arrogantly, as a lot of people do, is it the case that there is enough of a translation between personality of Secretary of State and policy that you actually might want to avoid someone who is personally arrogant? Now, I don't know the answer, but...
I don't know either. I mean, Holbrooke is a smart guy, though, and I'm assuming that anybody who's smart and who's been around the block and who studies international relations would know that our position in the world is not what it was 8 years ago, and it's not just because we have a bad reputation that we need to clean up. There are structural things that have happened in the last 15 years that, you know, we're going to have to find a way to maintain or restore our preeminence or influence, call it what you will, in a more fractured world, in a world where power is more diffuse than it used to be, and where forming coalitions so that there is a power block behind our positions is going to be a lot harder than it used to be. I don't know. It's a very tough thing. I mean, we're in a position that we are not used to being in, and who are the logical candidates to do this? I don't know, but there's a line. When Gates was having his confirmation hearings as Secretary of Defense, which I found just incredibly impressive. I mean, here was a guy who was asked hypothetical questions and he gave yes or no answers. It looked like he was a reasonable guy, and then he said, "Look, I want to keep in mind, I might recommend one thing or another, but the President of the United States is the one who makes the decisions." And that's certainly true. I mean, Bush, I think to a degree that some people find unbelievable, truly is the decider. I mean, there are people who influence that and people who know how to push the right buttons, but he's the one making the decisions.
And in that regard, you said you weren't enthusiastic about a McCain presidency. What's the kind of thing you most fear him doing?
Well, I think that I mean, he's a reasonable guy in a lot of ways, but I think his instinct when it comes to solving a foreign policy problem is to reach for a smart bomb, to reach for a tank and a smart bomb.
Mm-hmm.
I think he has a very militaristic view of foreign policy, and I think people in the world and here too are going to be looking for. One lesson that we've learned lately is that a lot of these problems are not military, are not fundamentally military in nature. They might be partly, military might help to a degree, but that's not where they're at. And I don't see anything in any statement that John McCain has made over the last 20 years that shows any sign of his understanding this.
Mm-hmm. But you're okay.
Plus,
you're okay with the idea of going around singing songs about bombing other countries. That part's okay.
Well, yeah, there's that too. But I mean, that's.
Maybe when he's president, he won't do that.
That is the least of it, in a way. What?
Maybe when he's president, he'll stop doing that.
I think
some people grow into the job and quit singing those songs.
Where did this giggle come from?
His
I
giggle?
haven't heard this before. He'll say something and then he'll go, hey, 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 hey. Where did that come from? I think that's new.
Well, it's important. I think it's important that you signify you're joking when you do sing songs about bombing other countries.
No, I don't know if he did that then, but I mean, some of his acceptance speeches, he'll just make some, typically political hackney joke, and then the crowd will applaud, and he'll go, hey, hey, hey. I've never heard that, but he's sounding like Lieberman.
And if he
maybe they're converging.
If he were a female, they would call it a cackle.
They would call it a cackle. They would call him coquettish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well, you're not going to believe it when I tell you how the time has flown by here, Fred.
How fast has the time flown?
We're over an hour. I mean, that's the joy of doing Blogging Heads.
Nobody is going to watch this thing.
No, somebody will. And almost certainly someone related to you. No,
that I think is you can guarantee no on that one.
We will push this into the blogosphere. We will find a way to. Wait till you see what happens to your Amazon numbers when
is that right? It's just it'll be more than what happened when I went on Fresh Air.
No, but
no,
it will be more than nothing. Okay. Hold up your book.
Hold up my. Where did it go? Here it is. Yeah. Okay, let's see. Yes, there it is. Whoops, hold on.
Daydream Believers.
Daydream Believers. How a few grand ideas wrecked American power in bookstores, I presume, everywhere.
Yeah. And we encourage,
I'm told anyway.
We encourage the Amazon route in particular.
Yep, it's certainly there.
And so, how has the publishing experience been? Somebody referred to the period right before a book comes out as the calm before the calm. but you've actually made a little bit of a stir.
I've made a little. My publishers put a full-page ad in the New Yorker, which kind of alarmed me.
Whoa!
I felt kind of like remember that story about Bill Gates. One time he went to a cocktail party, fancy cocktail party. A waiter was passing around very expensive champagne, and he said, "No, thanks, I'll take the cash instead." That's kind of what I felt like when I saw that ad.
Yeah.
But no, I have a decent print run. I have nothing to complain about so far.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
My editor was very good. A guy named Eric Nelson at Wiley.
Yeah.
So far, I'm sure when the sales figures come in, I'll start fuming and. But I.F. Stone told me, the great journalist.
Oh, not to drop any names or anything, but as I.F. Stone was telling you shortly before his death, go ahead.
As Izzy once told me.
Yeah.
I was complaining about how a book that I wrote 25 years ago was treated. This was
Wizards of Armageddon.
Yes, that's right. And he said, well, you know, all writers have problems with their publishers. I understand that God wasn't too pleased with the Gideons either. So, you know, I know very few authors.
If you've read that book, you know why. But
when's your God book coming out? Speaking,
I actually handed in a complete manuscript to my editor some weeks ago, 5 or 6 weeks ago. So,
all right.
Sometime in the next decade, the book will come out.
Excellent.
And
before the apocalypse, I assume.
I can't guarantee we'll get it out that soon, but I hope so. But anyway,
this has been a pleasure. Maybe I'll even do this again sometime.
You should. Isn't it fun and easy?
This is okay.
It's almost like you would pay us to do this, right?
I wouldn't go that far.
Well, but almost, I said. It's almost like that.
Okay, if you want, if you want to draw the line there, that's fine.
Okay. Well, my final words are, buy Fred's book.
That's a good one.
Yeah. I thought of it myself.
Well, I appreciate that.
Okay. Well, you deserve it.
Okay.
And your stuff in Slate is so well worth reading that I encourage that too.
Yeah, I hope that you start writing for Slate more often yourself.
Well, I'm kind of busy building a global media juggernaut at the moment, Fred.
Well, you can't do everything all at once.
I can't even do two things at once.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. Well, keep a pace with the global media juggernaut.
And thanks for your contribution to it.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Okay, see you around.
Okay, bye.